Welcome, everybody. I'm Ken Medlock, the Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies, and really happy to have you here today with a special edition of our webinar series. We're going to be focused on the future of LNG, and I'm incredibly happy to have Meg Gentle. She's the President and CEO of Tellurian on the line with me today. We're going to engage in a little bit of a conversation about the future of LNG, and I think the title of today's program will be made obvious through the course of our discussion as we talk about not only where we've been in global LNG markets, but where we will be going, or at least where we think we'll be going as we move forward sort of beyond 2020. The year 2020 has been remarkable, to say the least. We've seen stepping out of 2019, which was a record year for U.S. LNG exports and LNG flows more generally around the world, growth in commodity markets in general, rapid expansion of energy across the board, no matter what type of energy you're talking about, to different degrees in different places around the world, increasing impetus for policy to step into the energy domain and help sort of direct the future to an extent. And then COVID-19 happened, and that certainly did change things in ways that nobody anticipated. So it really begs a number of questions about what the future might hold beyond 2020, which I think we'll be looking back on in years to come as really just synonymous with uncertainty, because I think there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty across the energy spectrum as a result of what's happened this year. As I said, happy to have Meg on the line with me. Meg is President and CEO of Tellurian. I'm going to actually ask Meg to expand on her own background, because I always find that incredibly interesting when our guests actually talk about themselves a little bit and put a little personal spin into their own background. And I think it sets the stage for the discussion as well, given her history in the industry. So Meg, it's good to see you.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for having me on the show, so to speak. And thank you to everyone who's joined today. I'm sure I know a lot of people here in the audience, and some of you might know my background. Today, I'm the President and CEO of Tellurian. Tellurian's a company that was formed in early 2016 by Sharif Suki and Merton Houston, two pioneers and legends and visionary leaders in the LNG business. And we brought together, a team of really the best across the business, both from Cheniere and BG and everywhere, to put together a new global natural gas business. Prior to joining Tellurian, just after it was formed, I'd been with Cheniere for about almost 13 years. In finance and marketing, and actually had spent 3 years in London building the Cheniere marketing organization. So really, really proud to see the success of Cheniere as they brought Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi LNG terminals into production, something which has allowed the U.S. gas business to really change the LNG business and transform the global natural gas business into a true commodity.
So Meg, I think you and I first met back in 2003 working on a National Petroleum Council study about the future of natural gas in North America. And, I sometimes think back about, what we were thinking about back then, just in terms of what the future of natural gas looked like. There was a lot of discussion about LNG imports. A lot of discussion about the end of the gas bubble era, declining production, mature province, all the sort of buzzwords, even a lot of discussion about an Alaska natural gas pipeline and debate about whether it should be over the top or along the Alaska Highway. I mean, a lot of interesting sort of things to sort of reflect on. But I wonder if you could, just given that kind of setting, talk a little bit about what you've seen over the last 2 decades in the industry and how it's kind of shaped your approach to the industry.
I think that unfortunately means we're getting old, Ken, because that was when I worked for Anadarko, which actually Anadarko recruited me to move to Houston. and I moved here to Texas. I didn't know anyone, and pretty new to the energy business. And I think the National Petroleum Council continues to debate some of those same projects, and it's really a testament to how capital intensive the LNG business is, that the projects to bring new supply onto the market are just very large, take a lot of capital, have a lot of resource base behind them, and really take 10 to 30 years of development, some of them. What we've been able to do in the Gulf Coast is really to shorten that timeline so significantly, where new infrastructure projects can actually be envisioned, engineered, and designed and brought into production in well under 10 years. So, I think that's a huge revolution for the industry, and allows us to, deliver clean air on a faster pace as the market is continuing to expand, at double-digit levels.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the interesting things, just to build on the point you made, that I often discuss in public settings, but also with my students in the context of energy transitions, is the two biggest drivers of change over the last 2 decades have really been the shale revolution in the United States and North America more generally, and demand growth in Asia for all forms of energy. And I think both of those things have been real instigators of change in the LNG world. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about how you've seen that evolution unfold from a historical context, because we'll definitely get into the future very shortly. So.
Maybe I'll speak a little bit about Asia. And for the audience, I've sat on panels with Ken in Asia. I think one of the more recent ones was the Producer Consumer Summit in Tokyo, when we were still allowed to travel places. And Japan, Tokyo and Japan are such a traditional market. Frankly, the oldest LNG market. All of the original LNG development happened because the Japanese economy didn't have their own source of fuel, and they were trying to diversify as fast as they could off of oil, since they were acutely impacted by oil supply disruptions during World War II. And the market has changed so much in really the last even 10 years, with a proliferation of new markets. So Asia has become very different from the traditional Japan, Korea, Taiwan importers, to China and India, poised to become the largest two single importing countries. But the smaller Southeast Asian countries also representing almost 40 million tons. So, a little bit over half the Japanese market in their own right as a block of consuming countries. And we've seen sort of the tipping point be reached from Indonesia and Malaysia as a traditional supplier to becoming a hybrid of supplying LNG from their producing areas, but also starting to import LNG to match, dislocations in their own market. So, Asia's been 75% of the LNG market. We see that continuing, and in fact, we see them, driving most of the growth. So a little bit of growth coming from Europe and the Middle East, but probably 75% of the growth continuing to come from Asia.
So, touched on Asia, from a historical context and where you think things are going. No disagreement from my perspective of all on that front. But I want to return to that in just a minute. But I think we'd be remiss not to address what's happened this year. So kind of think about the current context of LNG, because it's led to a lot of questioning about the future of LNG from the United States in particular. And I wonder if you could comment on what, if anything, has fundamentally changed, or if this is just a blip on the radar and the long-term fundamentals are still very supportive of growth.
So I would say long-term fundamentals have not changed. In fact, for LNG, I think they've only strengthened for two reasons, and then I'll talk a little bit about the short term. First, that LNG prices right now are at all-time lows. So all over the world, $2 an MMBTU natural gas prices is really seeding a lot of demand that for the long term is going to become very inelastic. And second, that the COVID quarantine has put additional focus on the importance of respiratory health and clean air. And so natural gas is such an important and fast way of accomplishing a lot of the environmental goals that we all share worldwide. The short-term impacts are really acute because we have taken gas price down to $2. It hasn't recovered as fast as oil price. And we're starting to see in June, we had, I think, the first month that 2020 LNG trade was less than 2019. Having said that, still year to date, I think LNG trade is about 14% higher just because of the first quarter than the LNG trade in 2019. And we're now starting to see some of the turnaround. So China, which went into quarantine earliest, has recovered fairly steadily since February, their LNG imports. China now has 2 consecutive months of recovery. And I would say, those are kind of the bright spots in the existing data. And we have to watch it every single month for which economies are also turning back to growth for LNG. It's been fascinating, though, watching the LNG market behave as a true, mature commodity and energy source and watching it balance. Because as Asia needed to throw off some supply, Europe started importing more and was taking more LNG than it did in 2019. And that LNG largely filled storage and it backed out pipeline gas from Russia, where that Russian pipeline supply became the balancing factor almost, for the global market. And LNG went into European storage, and it also backed out pipeline gas from Russia into China. So that very, very competitively priced LNG found, other places to go. As that storage filled in Europe, which did happen, kind of end of May, June. Now they're continuing to fill, but at a much more moderate pace. The next balancing mechanism became supply side curtailment out of the U.S. and Australia primarily, but also Russia and then some of the other producing nations, in smaller amounts. And so the U.S. balancing mechanism is very robust. We have some of the largest storage capacity in the world. And we're going into our own summer air conditioning load season. So we actually have increasing demand in this country for air conditioning load. And through the COVID quarantine, I think keeping people at home actually kind of balanced out. And we had increasing gas usage in the US for power gen and for coal displacement. So the balancing of the LNG market has really been fascinating. And we've now just gotten the data for the September cargo loading schedule in the US. And even though it will still be curtailed from 100% capacity, it's only roughly half the curtailment that we saw June, July, August. So the call from the market for more LNG, you can start to see the early indicators, and that our expectation is that the market is turning around by the fall. More LNG is needed on the market. We'll still have a little bit of ways to go into the winter to wear off those high storage balances, but with some winter weather, we get back to a more normal functioning market, and then we are returned to the long term. And actually, I'm probably more bullish on the long term than I was before, and actually a little bit anxious because we are about to go into a bit of a supply shortage for the next 4-ish years. We've come off over the last 5 years, including this year, about 150 million tons of supply additions. And the next 4 or 5 years is about a third of that, only 50 million tons of supply additions. And that's going to happen at a time when the market is used to $2 LNG and really trying to grow, displace coal and displace transportation fuels to bring cleaner air by reducing diesel and coal.
So you mentioned a couple of things. I want to pull on these threads before we sort of look forward, because I think they'll help in doing so. You mentioned watching the LNG market, or the global gas market more generally, balance through the all the ripple effects associated with the global economic shutdown induced by COVID-19. And I find that remarkable because conversations in oil markets have, throughout all of this, have really been about what OPEC will do, what OPEC Plus will do, what agreements can be reached among countries. And you've really not seen that kind of conversation in earnest with natural gas. It really has been about market mechanisms. And I think it's kind of remarkable to see a market that is not as mature as oil really function in a way that one historically would only think about the U.S. market functioning. And I wonder if you could maybe comment a little bit on the following statement. The U.S. entering the global LNG market is doing more than just exporting U.S. gas. It's also exporting U.S. market fundamentals, U.S. market principles, U.S. market paradigms in many ways. I wonder if you could comment on that, and if you agree, disagree, and anything else you want to say.
Well, and Ken, you mentioned, and we didn't talk about yet, the U.S. shale gas revolution, really shale gas and oil, both production just from shale basins in the U.S. being one of the two big revolutionizing factors for the gas business overall, but certainly for the gas business and the oil business and the energy exporting business in the U.S. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. We now know that we have over 50 years of U.S. gas supply that's adequate to supply, our own market and all the expectations for needs from the international market, and that we're able to do that at less than $3 an MMBTU of production cost. So our competitiveness as a country, with many basins producing in fact even at less than $1 an MMBTU, leaves us in an advantaged position on a worldwide basis. We can bring gas supplies to the market that compete, with every other major producing area. And even with the infrastructure we have today, we will become, by end of this year or beginning of 2021, 20% of the LNG market. 20% will be supplied by the US. And with just a little bit of additional capacity additions, we will be, in fact, potentially the largest producer, where, the big three are now Qatar, Australia, and the US, with Russia a distant behind, but also growing their export capacity. So the opportunity then for the US to be a leader on energy, and a leader not only on energy, but on the formation of energy and the environment, and the responsibility that the hydrocarbon industry has to work together, for environmental initiatives, is really an incredible opportunity that marries together geopolitical goals of the administration, trade goals, balancing trade, and within the context of trade, finding partnerships and building those partnerships with trade partners and with international people and governments and countries to make a partnership model that lasts over decades and decades, so that we're working together, not against each other.
Right. So low prices. That is sort of the norm for the current market environment. And you mentioned how that actually has a stimulatory effect on demand. And I wonder, and this is where I think maybe we can step into another comment you just made about trade partners, and even this current administration, Pompeo recently stating, that there ought to be an increasing focus on looking at India as an alternative to China, for example. That was in the press today. Take that for what it is, but it makes me wonder on the gas front in particular, given that we can produce gas at such low cost and export it at such low cost. What sort of time lag do you envision because of the scale of infrastructure that's required to develop things on the demand side? Because this will kind of hint at the reason for the title of the presentation today.
We're getting there. We're getting to the city gate.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's more than just about power generation, right? You're really particularly when you get into something you've mentioned as well about environmental circumstance, so clean air requirements, stuff like that. Countries like India stand to gain tremendously from cleaner fuels like natural gas. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit about what you see over the next 3 to 5 years. You mentioned looming shortages. How will that actually, do you think, play out in the marketplace, given the scale of capital infrastructure that's required on the supply and demand side of the equation?
So the comments of Secretary Pompeo, I think, are really interesting when you also marry them together with some comments that Prime Minister Modi made, I think just yesterday, in the India Ideas Summit, which is an every 2 years event that happens between the US and India, where the Prime Minister also expressed an importance and an interest to be working in partnership with the US on energy and on natural gas. And that's been, a huge initiative of his, and also of Energy Minister Pradhan in India, as their own economy faces an acute need for natural gas, a desire to bring clean air to the country, and of course, an overarching goal to do that at very, very low cost. They'd been previously importing LNG in a kind of price range of roughly $8 to $10 an MMBTU. And we know that they can bring it from the US at much, much cheaper, even potentially half of the cost. And there are Indian companies, Gale and Petronet at least, that are participating in the LNG facilities in the US and lifting LNG from the US to take it to India. So within the context of those larger goals, India should be able to become roughly a 70 million ton LNG market from about 25 million tons today. And what's been a challenge for India, actually, because they have some very, very large regasification facilities that don't run at full capacity yet, because they have to interconnect them to the distribution grid behind the regas plant or the import terminal. And they have actually completed a lot of that, which means that the Kochi terminal is getting debottlenecked in southern India, and gas is making its way to the city gates. And so the city gates in India actually are wide open. There's another $100 billion of investment that's being spent on distribution centers. And they are moving LNG into the trucking industry to try to displace diesel in all of their heavy trucking fleets, which will, clean the air of particulates and SOx and NOx emissions, and actually even reduce CO2 emissions by 15 to 30%. So as we watch the Indian natural gas grid be finally better interconnected, they'll get to full utilization of their plants and have some additional facilities under construction. And we, on the supply side of the industry, have to, match that. And so the timeline of infrastructure investment is then so important because it takes us longer on the supply side. We've got to find the site, engineer the plant, and then it takes us about 4 years to actually construct the plant before we can bring new LNG online. And the US has been phenomenal to do that very quickly. So I do think there are very large terminals like Driftwood LNG at Tellurian and like some of the other projects on the Gulf Coast and elsewhere that are sitting ready to begin construction. And in 4 years, we'll be able to continue supporting India's growth.
So actually an interesting point that you just raised about it really speaks to the competitiveness of the U.S. With regard to timing, right? Because in a lot of ways, if you think think about some of the large scale LNG export projects in Australia that took it seemed like forever, right, to deliver first volumes. You contrast that to, and it was for a variety of reasons, but you contrast that to what's actually been happening in the United States, and it's pretty remarkable in how different it is. As we look forward, and we think about the current market environment, and we want to think about how the market environment might evolve. You just mentioned demand pull really being driven by access to the city gate because of growth of distribution centers, stuff like that. Do you think other countries will follow suit in addition to India in terms of expanding gas use beyond the power sector in a much more rigorous way? And do you think that the U.S. will still be in a position to respond? And if not adequately, where do you anticipate other supplies coming from so that this entire sort of LNG revolution doesn't get derailed? Because we all know high prices can lead to demand destruction rather than continued growth. So I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, power generation is still very, very important. And in fact, displacing coal makes an even larger impact on our battle with CO2 because replacing a coal-fired power plant with natural gas reduces CO2 emissions by 50%. And so, a new export terminal has the potential to reduce CO2 by, 10 times the amount of CO2 that's involved, in the production process. So power generation is still very important. And I do think many countries are following suit. One that I would mention in particular, which is just fascinating, is Vietnam, that people don't really talk about as an LNG market. They have two terminals that are coming online very, very soon and are expected to become a 30 million ton LNG market over time. So that's, not quite 10% of the LNG market today, which in total is at almost 400 million tons in total. But that is a very big number. That is a very big number, and they are replacing power generation primarily. That is something that we saw, in fact, over the last 5 years. Countries that did not import any LNG, like Pakistan and Bangladesh, coming in and really just needing natural gas to replace their own production and to support the massive proliferation of power generation for countries where, very low percentage of the population even has access to electricity. What I think is the next actual big sector is the transport sector. And we've seen the impact that we can have with policy in the IMO regulations, where LNG for the shipping industry is today, I think, only roughly 1 million tons, maybe of demand expected to go to, I think, roughly 18 million tons over the next couple years. The total shipping fleet, if it all converted to LNG for bunkering instead of oil-based fuel oil, it would consume as much as 200 million tons of LNG. So almost a 50% doubling of the market. So that's kind of the potential out there in shipping. And people started to realize, well, wait a second, we could displace diesel pollution from heavy trucking. And India and frankly also China have now thousands of filling stations that support their heavy trucking industry. And each of those countries are anticipating adding as much as 10 million tons of LNG demand for trucking per year. And it's meaningful, on society when you think about in India, I think over 1 million deaths per year are attributed to toxic air in India from pollution associated with diesel fumes and city dynamics on humid air that kind of keeps things settled in. So the demand potential in the transport sector, I don't think people are quite anticipating yet in the demand forecasts because it's so uncertain the pace that it could potentially go. And I think that from environmental policy standpoint, it's maybe a low-hanging fruit that we're not fully appreciating either, that it can go very fast and make significant impact. So that's one place where I would really watch to say, like, is that in addition to countries that just keep popping up as demand centers, what is the transport sector going to do? And in that case, the second part of your question really, will the supply side of the industry be prepared to respond? And wholeheartedly, I want that to be a yes, especially as the developer. Yes. There is ample supply of natural gas worldwide that is very low cost. A lot of it is in the US where we have transparent regulatory processes. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has been very efficient to say we make sure that the safety rules and the consult with the community happens and are followed, and that's what we regulate, and we let the industry determine which are the right projects. And we've got to continue to support our regulatory bodies to have that general philosophy that infrastructure is good. Investment in infrastructure in the US provides jobs. Each LNG plant brings 50,000 jobs on kind of total value chain, direct and indirect. And it's an important segment of our economy. It allows us to have exports and something to trade with. And it's really going to be supporting our regulatory agencies that allows the US to remain competitive in the overall effort to supply these growing sectors.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned trade and infrastructure, because I think that's sometimes a part of the discussion about the evolution of the marketplace that is kind of swept to the side, but it's obviously very important. We've already kind of touched on how rapidly things have progressed in the United States with regard to terminal development and infrastructure development. And you just mentioned how important that is for market depth. We, in fact, we published a study earlier this year looking at the evolution of the trade balance and the evolving trade policy of the United States. And the biggest bright spot since 2008 has really been on the energy front, where we've gone from deficit to surplus. And that is in spite of the fact that the trade deficit overall has continued to grow. So it definitely is something that has been completely facilitated by infrastructure. So it's that the point is definitely not lost. I guess there's a question that came through that I think is definitely linked to everything that we just talked about, though. With regard to local air quality, that's an incredibly important issue, as we know, in developing Asian economies, something that policymakers in those countries are dealing head on with, and the role that natural gas can potentially play there. But in other parts of the world, there is a push against the use of natural gas, with certain cities and counties and other types of municipalities banning natural gas, new connections, stuff like that. Do you see that as being a risk to the industry overall, or are they sort of one-off, kind of relatively small, isolated things? And if not, do you think that's something that could actually become more pervasive, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world as well?
I think, Ken, it is definitely a factor. And communities should be able to choose the infrastructure that they want built in their community, and the energy that they want to serve them. And they should be able to choose that in the context of open and transparent price and cost information, so that they can make a full choice. And the renewables, increasing renewable capacity from today, I think we're supplying roughly 3% of global energy from renewable power, and 85% of global energy from hydrocarbon, based energy. And so we have to work together in partnership to be able to increase our percentage of renewables, which we wholeheartedly support. And in fact, natural gas can be that most reliable partner, because it is a commodity now. It will have security. It has multiple producers and supply sources, so that reduces the political risk on using it as a fuel. It's very easy to install natural gas consuming infrastructure, and that can be done more quickly than even the supply side of natural gas infrastructure. And it is very flexible. So if your renewable power is running all day long, you don't need natural gas, you can store it. You can store it in liquid form or in gas form, and you can send it somewhere else. So it's very, very flexible to allow renewable, power and renewables in other sectors of energy to actually grow and flourish in a way that can be cost effective and can also be reliable for the grid. And we have seen those really amazing examples where natural gas has been so important, because the sun didn't shine and the wind didn't blow and the rain did not produce any hydro electricity. And there's some really great stories, especially in Europe, in the UK, in the case of wind, a lot of wind power, especially offshore UK. But when there's not enough wind to support that, the infrastructure has already been, the investment has been made in LNG import terminals. And so LNG demand went way up, so that a very clean burning alternative could backfill that wind drought. Another great example has been the Spanish market. Spain is actually one of the longest LNG importing countries. They imported LNG very, very early from Algeria, and then from Nigeria, and now from all over the world. So old, traditional LNG market, and they have been making the transition very hard into renewables of all sources. They have a lot of hydroelectric. They've been installing wind power and of course solar in sunny Spain. And when they don't have sun and rain and water, they are able to import LNG. And so we saw one year, in fact, a 50% increase in LNG imports in Spain from year to year. And so it's a very simple balance where natural gas infrastructure investments are not only an investment in natural gas, but they're actually an investment in supporting an economy to get to a more renewables-based economy. In some of the developing nations, the affordability of renewable with backup sources, because you have to incorporate that, you have to spend the money on the backup sources. And so that is not always as affordable for some of the developing economy communities. And I think that's where we see more challenge of we want to bring renewables in. We want government policies to support those renewables, but we've got to have cheap energy, or people just won't have access to electricity at all. I mean, we still have over 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to electricity. And to be able to bring them to a much higher standard of living by having that access to electricity and the safety and security that comes with that can really only happen quickly and affordably with natural gas.
So you just mentioned a couple of points that will allow me to sort of leg into some questions that have come through from our audience. One in particular I find very fascinating. It actually fits with several lines of research that we're engaged in here at the Baker Institute. In particular, you mentioned effectively that the liquidity benefits of natural gas as an evolving commodity market really allow that balancing service to be provided to energy markets in a relatively efficient way. And I think that's actually an interesting point that's sometimes lost in the conversation about the role that natural gas plays in complementing renewables, because a lot of these other markets are not as liquid. They're not as transparent. And so, that liquidity service is valuable. But that begs a question, and this is coming from our audience, that I know you've spent a lot of time talking about. You and I have talked about this. I think it'd be great if you just kind of dive into it just briefly here. But the models for financing LNG export projects have been changing as well. And there's several different approaches that are being used today, all to varying degrees of success. But I wonder if you could maybe comment on how that evolution has been occurring and where you think it's going.
Okay. So financing is my favorite topic. But let me set the stage for a second for everyone, because these projects are huge capital. So we talk about $1,000 a ton. Well, what is that? That means that building the Driftwood LNG terminal is a $27 billion project, because it is 27 million tons. So $27 billion, where does that come from? And we typically finance that, whether it's we, the developer companies, or even we, the majors in one way or another. The financing is coming roughly between 50 and 70% of it is coming from project finance banks. So those banks may be supplying capital directly to the project. Maybe are loaning it to a major oil and gas company in their overall corporate level financing. They may be funding a big, national oil company as they have some debt and some equity. But ultimately, in order to get the cost of capital way down, the bank market is funding a very, very large portion of that capital. And so to support a bank loan, you need reliable, dependable, credit-worthy cash flows, where buyers of the LNG or sponsors of the project are guaranteing that the bank debt is going to be repaid. And so the LNG business from 30, almost 40 years ago now, has had very long-term, 20, in some cases 30-year contracts that bring the LNG from one place to the next place. Then the ship goes back, gets the cargo again, brings it back. And it's, between these two, the buyer and the seller. And that guarantees the repayment of the loan. And then the buyer and the seller figure out together how to put the equity for the remaining 30% of the capital. And I went through this whole long explanation to make it very clear that we've had a major change in the business because the market is liquid enough. People are buying and selling cargoes every single day for, next month or 2 months from now, or maybe 6 months from now. But the trading part of all of the energy companies, organizations, is getting more robust to be able to move short-term LNG. And that means that buyers don't necessarily need to enter into 20-year contracts in order to buy LNG. Their LNG might be more expensive later because there may not be as much supply and they're going to compete with other buyers and bring up the price. But they can get the LNG at the market price, which is how the oil business transacts and trades.
Yeah.
So the challenge right now is, what is that business model that allows 70% of the project to get funded by the bank, and the bank to make sure that they're going to get paid back if there aren't 20-year contracts? And so we tried to do something very different with Driftwood, the LNG plant, so that the bank funding could come in. That's the lowest cost source of capital, and we are offering the project on a joint venture partnership. So the investors that bring the equity assure that they are going to lift the LNG. We give it to them at cost, so it's the cheapest that they can possibly get it. That helps them move LNG into their market at very, very competitive prices. And we move forward with the project as a partnership. And that partnership has some really interesting components. It's a partnership on the infrastructure. It's actually an integrated project. So we'll be partners producing gas in a shale gas field in North Louisiana, the Haynesville gas field. And that gas will go to the plant at cost. And then we'll load LNG for $3.50 or less in the Gulf Coast. So we're delivered in Asia for $5 or less. And we work with our partners on that very low cost basis. And then the partnership becomes another very important component of that, geopolitical strengthening ties, making sure we are, partners in business and partners as nations for, many decades to come.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you and I we've talked about this before, so I kind of knew where you were going to go, but thank you for expounding on that.
Me up.
Yeah. But
did I answer correctly?
You did great. Yeah. Yeah. No, but the one thing that is, I think, remarkable about that is, given that you're actually loading at cost, it does provide significant option value for flexibility and destination, right? So to the buyer of the LNG, ultimately, they have the ability to arbitrage price differentials, which I think makes the kind of model that you're proposing incredibly attractive. I guess time will tell, right, to see sort of how the business sort of evolves. But I think, as you mentioned, we're definitely seeing a lot of diversification just through either horizontal integration by multiple assets, so individual LNG suppliers can trade in their own portfolio to capture arb values, but there's a lot of interesting things going on that help with financing. And it's certainly a market that's evolving. So one more question, and then I'll close with a final question, which is going to shift gears dramatically, but I think you'll enjoy it anyway. The one question that came through from one of our listeners is in relation to small scale LNG opportunities. And the question specifically is really aimed at understanding how markets like markets in the Caribbean might be able to continue to grow their gas presence, even in the wake of maybe a pending supply crunch, or if do you think that that could be upended, and if not, sort of why? I mean, what sort of activities are occurring in the Gulf Coast and in general in the LNG market that will help continue to propel those small scale opportunities?
So the small scale market is so interesting, and in fact, I would break it really into the Caribbean, Gulf Coast, Caribbean market, and then the Mediterranean market, maybe even sort of the North Sea market. Some of the Scandinavian countries are now developing small scale import terminals. And then even potentially later in some of the like Indonesian archipelago, like all the islands there. So there are some interesting pockets in the world where there are especially island countries or island chains that would benefit from natural gas, and they're primarily running power off of fuel oil. When oil was $120 a barrel, there were so many projects that were trying to get going because the cost pressure from running an island economy, which is probably very tourism based, and now has just had skyrocketing power gen costs because they're at the mercy of the oil market. And so if they could diversify with LNG, just the profit opportunity was overwhelming in addition to the environmental benefits. And so what really needs to happen, the answer is yes, that can happen, and LNG can be very reliable for those economies. There has to be a hub and spoke kind of thing developed. So you're not going to take a big LNG tanker. I mean, these are massive. They hold between 3 and 5 billion cubic feet of natural gas in liquid form. You're not going to take a large tanker from the US and bring it to the Bahamas and unload just a small portion of it, because the value of that cargo is just too great. It's got to go immediately to a very large market. And because the offloading terminal is so small, it's not going to take a huge vessel. So we looked to places like Panama or the Dominican Republic, where large regas terminals could be installed. And you bring the LNG to the import terminal, it offloads, you keep it in storage as LNG, and then bunker size ships come with ISO containers on them. They fill from the big station, and then they go to the Bahamas or St. Kitts or St. Thomas, little by little with ISO containers. And that's going to have to be how you take this massive scale economy business and break it down with hub and spoke so that we can serve all those smaller countries. And that is starting to happen.
Great. So I'm conscious of time, and so I'm going to ask a final question, and this may feel like it's out of left field because it's not really related to LNG specifically. It's really more related to you and your success, your career path. One of our members asked a question specifically about women in energy, and wondered if you might have any interesting insights to share with regard to your own career path and the success that you've enjoyed, and how other women might be able to potentially follow in your footsteps.
I think I'm always honored actually to be asked that question. And I feel, quite frankly, very unique and special in this industry to, sort of be in the minority. And sometimes we act like we're in the minority rather than realizing it's such a gift to actually be able to stand out as a little bit different. So I would really encourage people to, and this is really for everyone, find the strengths about yourself and the things that make you, unique, special, and different, because those things are the skills that, you bring to your team or your company or your industry that is a little bit different, maybe way of thinking, or way of tackling a problem that makes you and all of us such a valuable part of the team, and in an industry that I think is just full of so many amazing, high performing, highly educated, high tech. We think we're not in the tech industry, but our industry is so high tech. And to be, part of that, like, really incredible industry, we have got to all, stand up at a time when energy is always under attack, to say that, what we are doing for the world is actually amazing, for the environment, for economic growth, for the standard of living of people, and moving around the world and getting educated. And so to stand up and be proud of that and be a leader for people even in other industries is I think inspiring. And then my last little anecdote is just work your ass off.
Excellent. Thank you, Meg. Thank you so much for joining us. Your insights were fantastic. Even had one comment come through talking about how knowledgeable and transparent you were, and just a sincere thank you. So
well, thank you to that person. Yeah.
It's great to see you, and look forward to when we can actually do this in person. But to everybody else, stay safe, stay healthy, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Ken, and to the Baker Institute for all that you do, even with research for the industry and education for the industry, and really bringing together at Rice, which many of you know is my alma mater from business school. But really, the Baker Institute really bringing together, energy, government policy, international trade, and even the MBA school there from across the courtyard. It's really a pleasure to work together with the Institute and Ken, with you, and over too many decades now of friendship. So thank you for having me today on the podcast.
Anytime. Thanks, Meg.
Okay. Thank you, Ken.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.